working? Oh, yeah, I can hear myself. Yeah, so I can start now. Yeah. Cool. Hi, my name is Marta Paciorkowska. I'm a software engineer, and I used to be a professional translator and study English literature, where I wrote a lot of critical papers. And that's all that you need to know about me for the time being. Before we start, I just want to say two things. First thing, I'm just going to show you. Can I have some volunteers? This side, yeah. This is going to be pretty long. You can't see it in the back, but what is important is that this is basically 60 years, just 60 years of the evolution of programming languages, and this is about basically half of it. You have, starts with Fortran in 1954 and ends with Ruby in 2013, Ruby and Python and other stuff. And this is maintained by Eric Levinas, who's been doing it for like over 10 years, and I wanted to show you this because it's super complicated. And sometimes we don't realize how complicated the field that we work in is. Thank you very much. And the second thing I wanted to show you is a book, How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. I've actually read it, and really, and I'm mentioning it now because what the author says, basically, that right now it is impossible, even if you specialize in something, it is impossible to read every book from a field that you want to specialize in, and the same is with programming languages. It's just too much. So that's the things I wanted to mention before I start my talk. And the third thing is an important note. I'm European, and I kind of realized that only almost after coming here, that I'm coming to South America with a different culture. So I'm sorry for using mostly Western European authors, but I'm gonna give you a very short, a brief walkthrough of how it all went down, and in Europe and in North America. So the first epoch recognized in Europe was antiquity. Basically, it was about almost all of the people, famous people were smart, bearded men who kind of created the basics of philosophy. And when it comes to writing, the writers there then, like Homer with his Iliad, created very epic stories of other bearded men with adventures slaying dragons and gods and everything. After that came the Middle Ages, which were also a long period, and they kind of didn't like antiquity. I'll talk about it a bit later, but on the literature level, they were also fond of epic and brutal stories, but the thing is that in this period, those stories were very, very structured. It was about slaying dragons, but at the same time, there were a lot of rules that you had to follow. One of them is alliteration, which means that a lot of words in a sentence needed to start with the same letter. And an example is Beowulf. Just read you one sentence. He is hasped and hooped and hurpling with pain, limping and looped in it, which you can see a lot of H's and L's. After the Middle Ages came the Renaissance and Enlightenment, and I'm going to talk about them, come back to them later. Basically, brutality is passé. It's no more cool. And it's all about reason by capital R, but I'll come back to this later. After the ages of reason came Romanticism. You know the word romantic, but it kind of changed its meaning during the couple hundred years. Yeah, sorry. And it gets complicated because it came a couple hundred years after Gutenberg reinvented printing in Europe. Print was already in China for a couple hundred, if not thousands of years, but that allowed ideas to spread quicker, and that's why within Romanticism you have a lot of trends, country-specific. In the United States, it would be Transcendentalism, which kind of wanted to, was inspired by the white immigrants looking for the Western frontier. And for example, in Poland, you have National Romanticism, which focused on Poland's not so cool political situation. Then came Realism and Existentialism, which kind of, you can describe them shortly as what happens when Romanticism does a reality check. It means that it was okay to ask questions. You were supposed to ask questions about the the essence of the human being, and the answers were quite sad most of the time. But on the other hand, you had beginnings of social movements, like workers' rights and suffragettes. And as I mentioned with asking those questions led to being focused on the banal, the normal, the mundane, the everyday person. And if you kind of resembles normcore fashion, which is fashionable right now. So after that came modernism, which is kind of where it's getting interesting. Modernism decided to never look back and boldly go where no man has gone before. It focused itself on the future. We don't care about the past. We want to build railways. We want to build glass houses. And you can see that also in literature when experimenting and creating new forms of expression became trendy. And an example of a new technique that was developed then is called stream of consciousness. And if you don't understand what's going on here, it's perfectly okay, because almost no one does. This is a quote from Ulysses, written by a famous guy named James Joyce. This is a book that's a couple hundred pages long, but only consists of one sentence. And basically, stream of consciousness is kind of like a brain dump, to put it shortly. And after modernism came something that we're living in today, although not everyone would agree, but I'm one of the people that agrees that we live in postmodernism. And it pushed forward, basically to the extremes, new methods of literary or artistic expression. And if you don't understand something, it means that the author is doing it right, but I'm going to come back to it later also. And important note, epochs never had strict boundaries, they would overlap. And in general, you can say that there were two approaches to progress. One was to build something completely new, so imagine a phoenix rising from the ashes. And another one was to take what's best from the past and use it to build something new. You can think of the Go programming language, for example, if you want a programming metaphor. So after, a couple words about the evolution of programming languages. The first thing is that it's important to draw a distinction between evolution of specific concepts and specific languages. The concepts, which I'm quoting an article from 1972 from Jean Semet that I will quote more later, the chronological concepts, which were already looked at in the 1970s and probably earlier. The first thing that was necessary was creating a formal syntactic notation, because the language has to have syntax. Then it was supposed to go towards semantic definitional techniques. Then it was time, after developing those two, it was high time for looking at higher level language, which wouldn't be just machine instructions and would be human readable. And the last concept mentioned there was user-defined languages. And when you look at all of that, you can see that basically we've developed all of that. When you think of user-defined languages, you can think of, for example, of DSLs within languages. I think that's a good example. And another thing, just like with literary epochs, new concepts don't mean that old languages are obsolete, because we simultaneously use different paradigms. My boss 10 years ago was working on maintaining a project written in BASIC, and it was actually working quite well, which is probably surprising. And I'm sorry, this is probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say since I'm on a Ruby conference. Ruby isn't the best language in the world, basically because there is no best language in the world. You choose the language that you need. Okay, so getting to the common processes, because that's what I'm supposed to talk about here. The first thing that I want to mention is something I call the Holy Grail. So this is a quote. I'm not going to read all of this. This is a quote from 1972. It basically, the most important thing is the first part. Why does it show mirror screens? gosh, I'm sorry about that. The ease of communication with the computer allows the user to specify his or her instruction in a natural language such as English. That is a shortcut to saying that the user could use his or her native language, including notation. So basically, a dream that appeared probably before 1972 was to be able to write a language, like write instructions to a computer in natural language and have the computer understand that. But at that time, it sounded pretty awesome and pretty futuristic, but there were more important things that you had to focus on when developing new languages. And then in 1991, 1993 came Python and Ruby. And in the beginning, they had English-like vocabulary, but aims to have English-like syntax came only about 10 years later. There was also AppleScript, which was a scripting language for Apple computers, which was supposed to be completely localizable. So you could write instructions in English, in German, and so on. But that didn't really work out well. But then came the Shakespeare esoteric programming language. I don't know if you've heard of it. If you heard of it, cool. If not, then you're going to hear of it now. Esoteric programming languages can be shortly defined as languages whose main goal is not to be used in production. So this is 1/3 of a Hello World program written in Shakespeare. I'm not going to read everything. The important things that you're supposed to know is that in the beginning you define the characters of the play. Then you have acts and scenes where those characters interact. So for example, you have Hamlet, the flatterer of Andersen insulting A.S. And then Hamlet says a couple paragraphs. And then other characters say some stuff later on. So it is in English, but you have no idea what the lines in that fragment of code, what they actually do. And the authors of Shakespeare say that their design goal was to create a beautiful source code that would resemble Shakespeare's plays, but there are really basic control structures, so what you can do with that program is quite limited. So you can see we're not getting there, but the fact that this concept was brought back somewhere in the 90s is very interesting. It means that the basic needs that we had when developing new programming languages were fulfilled. So comparing this to what was going on in literature, as I mentioned, antiquity and the basics, like creating the basics of philosophy, science, and literary works, I want to quote Aristotle, who was one of the famous antique philosophers, who basically says that reason defines us as humans more than the fact that we have legs or hands, which means reason is more important than physical appearance. And it was something that defined antiquity. But then came the Middle Ages, and they kind of had different priorities. You probably heard of Black Death, which was kind of important event or period. There was also Christianity, which wanted to unite Europe. So other things became more important. And also people like Galileo and Copernicus, who promoted heliocentrism, so the idea that it is the Earth that revolves around the sun, had a pretty nice time. They had a pretty hard time because of the ideas that they had. So you have a picture of what was going on. But then the Renaissance and Enlightenment came, and philosophers and writers like Kant or Diderot brought antiquity back because it wasn't about religion anymore. It was about reason by capital R. And here's a quote from Immanuel Kant, who is a German philosopher. He says that basically there is nothing higher than reason. And Diderot says that reason is to the philosopher what grace is to the Christian. So it means that reason defines philosophers and writers, because Diderot was a writer. So you can say that Kant and the creators of Shakespeare were the first hipsters, because, yeah, they brought something back. And I think it's really interesting to see to analyze this trend further, but unfortunately I don't have the time. So the second thing I wanted to show you is about postmodernism. I already said a couple words about it before, but now we're going to dwell on it. I am very sorry. I'm very sorry, I tried. So this is a poem called N by E.E. Cummings. Even though this mirror screen shows you can see the whole poem, can you read it? It's quite hard. It takes no space on the page. The letters are randomly capitalized, randomly broken, and it really takes a lot of time to understand that what this poem says is nothing can surpass the mystery of stillness. So it's very minimalistic. It has a message which is obscured. Then another poem by Charles Bernstein, who is an American poet. You don't have to read everything, but what is important that when you look at a couple words like interpretative proastiture, then if you don't understand them, then it's perfectly fine because those aren't real words. Bernstein wrote a poem that was based on typos made on purpose. So you see those typos, it's difficult for you to understand what actually this poem means, and it takes a lot of effort because Bernstein did it on purpose, bad person. But then when it comes to languages that I think are kind of show the idea of postmodernism, maybe some of you heard about brainfuck, and this is 99 bottles written in brainfuck. I don't know if anybody knows what line 10 does. I have no idea. So the awesome thing about brainfuck is that it uses only 8 instructions. It's only 8 characters you can use from. But if I remember correctly, it is Turing complete, which means that it can perform a certain set of algorithms. And it's impossible to understand it, but it can do so much. It is basically, like I said, the essence. And I think it makes us wonder and challenge the idea of what are the essential traits of programming language, that they have to actually be readable, for example. And maybe you heard about Malbolge. This is Hello World in Malbolge, and it isn't even really Hello World. I don't know if you people in the back can see that, but essentially just a lot of random characters. It really isn't even proper Hello World because the letters, the output, are randomly capitalized. And this program wasn't even written by a human. It was written by an algorithm written by a human. You might wonder why, but there's an awesome quote about Malbolge on Wikipedia, which basically says that the fact that this language is useful is a weakness in its design. So it kind of resembles the poem that I showed you, written by Bernstein, that you can put a lot of work to make it harder for the reader. But that's what postmodernism was about. It was about pushing the writer to the extremes, to show them how you can reorganize language and kind of make you think about it out of the box. So another thing I wanted to mention is a more high-level process. We're going to talk about socio-economical situations now. First of all, we stand on the shoulders of giants, which means that we have it quite easy thanks to hundreds of people that created the basics for us. And if you think it's universal for all sciences, think about medicine. Can you become a doctor after a medicine bootcamp? I don't think so. Can you get an internship or maybe even sometimes a junior developer job after a Rails Girls weekend? It is possible. And you take a semester of creative writing classes and you can be the next Paulo Coelho, or better, hopefully. So another thing is that let's moderately assume that literature, the basics of literature were established like 3,000 years ago. which is a very modest number. And let's extend the evolution of programming language to, I don't know, 200 years. That's more or less a couple years before Ada Lovelace, first programmer. And let's look at the difference. 3,000 years ago, women and people of color weren't really considered people. And now, like 200 years ago, women had, in a lot of places, women had voting rights, and slavery, at least in theory, was abolished. And so both started in a very different time, but unfortunately, interestingly, both had a similar problem with exclusion. So the thing is that I'm going to show you two pictures. This is a team of DuckDuckGo developers. They look kind of like most of the team's pictures that you see on website. But when you look at this, you forget about stuff like this. The fact that most programmers in the beginning, well, most of these half were women, which means that kind of the history got rewritten, and you have to only rediscover again what women and other minorities that had an impact in computer science, in programming. And in literature, it is a bit similar. When you look at Nobel Prize winners in literature, only out of 110, only 13 were women. But there is a difference, because women don't get harassed at the prize-giving ceremony. I think about some conferences that happened with really bad outcomes. So this is a difference, and I think it shows that writers as a community, let's say, are way ahead of us, and the sad thing is, if you follow what's going on in North America, in the Ruby community, where women leave, in the IT community, where women leave because of harassment, it kind of shows that, unfortunately, we're going to be stuck in that unequal status quo a bit longer, but we should aspire to change that. And the last thing I wanted to show you is how the two separate worlds of literary arts and programming languages at one point got together. And I think it's pretty fascinating, probably the most interesting thing from the ones that I mentioned. So these paths have finally crossed, and it's, for example, like one of the reasons is the development of technology and new media art, which use the new media to produce art. And the outcomes can be sometimes surprising and very inspiring. And quoting Geoff Cox, who wrote an awesome book called Speaking Code, that if program code is like speech, then you can also say that it is like poetry. And the analogy to poetry suggests numerous aesthetic and critical possibilities for code, beyond it being simply a means of production. And I'd like to show you a piece of code from a piece of something called, written by Graham Harwood from a collection called Class Library. It looks like code, but it has some syntax, it has some indentation, somewhere spaces, but what's the purpose of this? Is it supposed to write a program? Or is it supposed to be more socially engaged? In my personal opinion, and I'm not the only one, this is a pretty cool poem. And if this isn't a poem, then I don't really know what a poem is today. And I think it's awesome to look at stuff like that. And coming to a conclusion, I only managed to scratch the surface. This is a very, very broad topic. You could probably write books about it. But I'd like you to treat this as an encouragement to analyze this stuff, because we don't exist in a culture of vacuum. As you can see, different fields, even if they look, at first they look like they have nothing in common, actually might have a lot in common, and you can learn from that. And last quote, again from Geoff Cox. Programmers express themselves through the use of program languages in ways similar to other human communicative expressions, so ways humans express themselves through language. And programmers do this through their manipulations of layers of representation including symbols, then words, then language. And look at this quote and remove the word programmers and put in the word writers, and you will see that it makes sense basically in the same way. So I think it's awesome if you can describe those two groups in the same way. And before I thank you for listening to me, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who supported me financially. Some of you might know that I started a crowdfunding campaign in order to get here, to pay for a plane ticket. And I like to thank all the people that retweeted me or tweeted about it. And I also like to thank all the people that donated cash to me without knowing me and just reading my pledge page. And I think it's pretty awesome, and it shows that our community is actually quite awesome sometimes. And even though a lot of people on that list are anonymous, I know who they are because I get PayPal notifications. So I think they deserve a round of applause. And thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you found that interesting. And if you'd like to, I don't know if you have time for questions or something, but if not, then you can also come to me afterwards. I'm really interested in what you think. So thank you.